Chapter 1. The Broken One. Vashkai was a city of shadows and neon, a place where the lost, the forgotten, and the discarded gathered in the crevices of a universe that had no use for them. Built into the jagged cliffs of a dying world, the city never slept, never slowed, never cared. The air was thick with the scent of metal and oil, laced with the ever-present stench of industrial waste that seeped into everything, coating the streets in a film of grime. Rain fell in relentless sheets, pooling in the uneven cracks of the pavement, turning the filth into something even more putrid, washing away nothing but the illusion of cleanliness. For those who had power, wealth, or connections, Vashkai was a stepping stone, a lawless trade hub where deals were made in the backrooms of black market bazaars, where cargo changed hands with no records, where bounty hunters found their marks and slavers whispered their offers. For those who had nothing, it was a prison, a place where the unwanted were left to rot, their lives reduced to waiting for death in the alleys of a city that would never acknowledge them. Alana sat on the cold stone steps of an abandoned docking bay, staring out at the city with empty eyes, her body curled inward against the freezing wind. Her cloak was soaked through, the thin fabric clinging to her skin, offering no real protection against the elements. She had stopped noticing the cold weeks ago, or maybe months. She wasn't sure anymore. Her right leg, a rusted cybernetic prosthetic, barely functioned, the exposed wiring sparking every time she moved. The metal plating was warped, the servos damaged, the joint barely supporting her weight. The limb had once been state-of-the-art, sleek and elegant, an extension of the body she had been born with. Now, it was nothing but a piece of junk, barely better than the stumps many others in the lower districts had been left with. Her left arm was worse. Not metal, not cybernetic, just broken. The nerves had been severed in an accident she no longer liked to think about, leaving her with a limb that barely obeyed her commands. The fingers moved when she willed them to, but only just, and only in small, painful twitches. The arm had become a dead weight, an anchor that dragged her further down in a world that already saw her as less than nothing. She had once moved with grace, had once been a dancer among the stars, had once soared through the air with a fluidity that made her truly Kalreth, a child of the wind, of motion, of freedom. But the Kalreth had no use for the broken. They had no use for a girl who could no longer walk without stumbling, who could no longer balance on the narrow beams of their skybound cities, who could no longer prove herself in the way all Kalreth were meant to. And so, they had cast her out. No trial, no ceremony, no last words spoken in her honor. Just a verdict. You are not one of us anymore. She had begged. She had pleaded. She had promised to find another way, to serve in some capacity, to prove she still had worth. But they had only looked at her with cold, unreadable eyes, their judgment already made. They had given her a bag of supplies, a handful of credits, and a one-way ticket to the Outer Rim. And that was that. Now, she was here. In Vashkai, where no one wanted her, no one would hire her. No one cared if she lived or died. She had tried to find work. She had tried to fix her prosthetic, to rebuild what had been taken from her. But no one wanted a crippled Kalreth who could barely move, who winced when she stood, who could no longer be what she was meant to be. She had tried to survive. She had failed. Now, she simply existed, sitting in the shadows, watching the city move around her, watching people pass without a second glance, waiting for something to change, but knowing it never would. She was nothing. And then, through the rain, through the haze of neon lights and moving bodies, she saw him. A human. And everything changed. The human who didn't turn away. He was not the first off-worlder she had seen in Vashkai. The city was filled with them traitors, smugglers, drifters, criminals, people who used the lawless expanse of the city as a stepping stone to something else. But he was different. He wasn't moving with the hurried pace of a merchant, nor did he have the calculating gaze of a bounty hunter. He wasn't dressed in the heavy armor of a mercenary, nor did he carry himself with the swagger of a pirate. He was ordinary. A simple jacket, worn boots, a tool belt filled with mechanical equipment. His dark hair was slightly unkempt, his hands calloused, the grease stains on his sleeves telling her what he was before he even spoke. A mechanic. He walked with purpose, but not urgency, his gaze sweeping the street with something that looked like curiosity, rather than suspicion. He was not afraid of this place, but he did not belong to it either. And then, he saw her. She knew it immediately. She had spent so long being ignored, being invisible, that she could always tell when someone's eyes actually landed on her. Most people, when they noticed her at all, did one of two things: either they sneered and kept walking, or they pretended she wasn't there. But this human stopped. He stopped, and that alone was enough to send a chill down her spine. She tensed, preparing for the worst. But it never came. Instead, he took a slow step forward, his expression unreadable, his eyes flicking from her ruined leg to her limp arm, then back to her face. She braced herself for the insult, for the pity, for the dismissal. But all he said was, "You need a new prosthetic." She blinked. That was not what she had been expecting. He crouched down slightly, still a few feet away, keeping his movements slow, measured. He wasn't looking at her like she was an object. He was looking at her like she was a problem to be solved, like she was fixable. She swallowed hard. "I don't have the credits for one." His gaze flicked toward her damaged limb again, eyes narrowing slightly as if assessing it. "It's not just the leg, is it?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Nerve damage." She expected him to turn away then, to lose interest now that he knew she was more than just a simple repair job. Instead, he nodded to himself, as if coming to a decision. "I can fix that." Her breath hitched. He said it so easily, as if it was just a matter of wires and circuits, metal and bolts, not a lifetime of being told she was beyond repair. She narrowed her eyes. Why? Most people in this city only helped when there was something to gain. The human gave her a small, tired smile. "Because I hate seeing things left to rust when they still have a chance to move." Her chest tightened. She had spent so long sitting in the dirt, waiting for her body to fail her completely, waiting to become just another piece of forgotten scrap in a city of broken things. And now, this human was offering her a choice. To stay here, or to move again. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure what scared her more. Chapter 2. Rebuilding the Lost. Alana didn't trust hope. Hope had been a knife in the dark, a whisper of something beautiful and impossible, only for it to be torn away at the last moment, leaving behind nothing but emptiness and pain. She had been abandoned, discarded, left to rust like a piece of broken machinery, and she had learned no one gave without expecting something in return. And yet, here she was, sitting on a metal workbench inside a human ship, listening to the hum of an unfamiliar engine, surrounded by tools and parts she hadn't touched in years. The workshop smelled like oil, coolant, and old metal, a scent that should have been comforting, yet all it did was make her feel small, exposed, uncertain. Ethan the human, the mechanic, the man who had stopped when no one else did, was moving around the room, gathering equipment with the practiced ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. He wasn't talking, wasn't explaining what he was doing, just working, scanning her damaged prosthetic with a focused expression, occasionally muttering something under his breath when he found something particularly broken. She watched him with guarded eyes, fingers curled tightly around the edges of her cloak, resisting the urge to pull away whenever he got too close. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate what he was offering. It was that she didn't believe it was real. She had learned the rules of survival a long time ago. No one helped for free. No one fixed broken things unless they could be sold for parts. And she had nothing left to offer. "What do you want from me?" The words came out sharper than she intended, but she couldn't take them back. Ethan didn't look up from his work. "What do you mean?" She narrowed her eyes. "You picked me up off the street. You're fixing me. People don't just do that." He finally glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Maybe they should." She swallowed. "That's not how the world works." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, I know." His voice was quieter now, as if he was remembering something she wasn't meant to hear. "Doesn't mean it has to stay that way." She didn't know how to respond to that. So instead, she sat in tense silence as he continued his work, trying to ignore the feeling that, for the first time in years, someone saw her as something more than a broken thing. The pain of repair. Fixing a machine was easy. Fixing a person was something else entirely. Alana knew pain. She had felt it in 1,000 different ways: hunger, exhaustion, rejection, loneliness. But there was something about having her prosthetic removed, torn apart, rebuilt piece by piece that made her stomach twist in a way she couldn't explain. Ethan was careful, methodical, his hands steady as he worked, but it didn't stop the memories from surfacing. She remembered the accident that had taken her limb, the way her body had crashed into the steel of the airship's railing, the sharp pain of bone breaking, the overwhelming horror of knowing that she was falling. The Calreth were supposed to be graceful, untouchable, moving like wind across the skies. She had been clumsy, too slow, too weak to save herself. And when they had found her, bleeding and broken, they hadn't mourned. They had looked at her with pity. And then, they had turned away. Ethan's voice pulled her back to the present. It's not just the leg. Your nerves are fried. She clenched her jaw. I know. His eyes flicked to her useless arm, still cradled against her side. I can fix that too. She shook her head. You don't have the tech for that. He studied her for a long moment, then turned to his workbench. We'll see. She frowned. What does that mean? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled something from a storage compartment, a small, metallic device with strange, pulsing circuits running along its edges. She inhaled sharply. That's Calreth technology. Ethan gave her a crooked smile. Found it in a scrapyard a couple of years back. Didn't know what it was until now. He tilted his head, his expression challenging. Think you can help me make it work? She hesitated. No one had asked for her help in years. But slowly, her fingers reached forward. And for the first time in a long time, she started to rebuild. Learning to move again. The first time she stood on her newly repaired leg, she almost collapsed. The servos whirred smoothly, the support frame holding firm, but her body had grown so used to imbalance, to failure, to pain, that standing upright felt wrong. Ethan was there in an instant, steadying her before she could fall. She hated that she needed the help, hated that she wasn't strong enough to do this on her own. But she didn't pull away. Not this time. Her breath came in short, uneven bursts, her entire body trembling as she took her first step. Then another. Then another. She wasn't graceful. She wasn't fast. She wasn't who she had been before. But she was moving. And that was enough. For now. A new path, a new name. Days passed. She learned to walk again, to balance again, to use her arm again. The Calreth technology had fused with her nervous system, restoring sensation to her once dead limb, allowing her to move her fingers without the pain of memory holding her back. She wasn't fixed, but she wasn't broken anymore. Ethan watched her progress with something like pride, though he never said it outright. He just smirked whenever she took a step without falling, nodded whenever she managed to lift an object with her once dead hand, handed her tools without comment when she started helping with ship repairs. And slowly, so slowly, she almost didn't notice it happening. She stopped thinking of herself as an outcast. Stopped thinking of herself as worthless. Stopped waiting for the day Ethan would decide she wasn't worth the effort. Because that day never came. One night, as they sat in the ship's cockpit, staring out at the vast stretch of empty stars, Ethan leaned back in his chair and said, So, where to next? She blinked. What? He shrugged. You don't have to stay here. But you don't have to leave either. Your choice. She swallowed. It had been so long since she'd been given a choice. She thought about her old name, her old life, the people who had abandoned her. And then, she thought about the mechanic who had stopped, who had fixed her, who had given her the chance to be something more than just another piece of forgotten scrap. She took a slow breath. And then, she made her choice. Let's see where the stars take us. Chapter 3. A future worth fighting for. The first time Alana set foot on a planet outside of Vashkai, she almost stumbled from the sheer strangeness of it. The gravity was different, the air cleaner than the industrial pollution she had been breathing for years, the sunlight hitting her skin in a way that felt foreign and unfamiliar after so long spent under artificial lights. She had grown accustomed to the cramped hallways of Ethan's ship, to the scent of grease and metal, to the quiet hum of machinery that was constant, predictable, safe. But now, standing beneath the vast, open sky of an alien world, she felt exposed, as if the universe had finally decided to take notice of her again. Ethan watched her from the ship's loading ramp, arms crossed, an amused smile tugging at the corner of his lips. You're looking at the sky like it's about to attack you. She scowled at him. It feels too big. He chuckled. Yeah. Took me a while to get used to it too, the first time I left a station. She glanced at him, curiosity flickering in her gaze. You weren't born on a planet? Ethan shook his head. Nah. Grew up on a colony ship. Spent the first 15 years of my life drifting through space, fixing things that broke down before they could kill us all. He motioned toward the landscape ahead. Didn't touch real dirt until I was 17. Thought I was going to sink into the ground at first. She smirked slightly at the thought of it. Let me guess. You tripped. His grin widened. Flat on my face. She huffed a quiet laugh. It was strange, how easily the banter came between them now. A few weeks ago, she had barely spoken more than a few words at a time. Her instinct still screaming at her to stay quiet, stay invisible, stay unimportant. But Ethan didn't let her do that. He dragged her into conversations, made her help with repairs, forced her to talk and act and exist in a way she had almost forgotten how to do. She wasn't sure how she felt about it yet, but she knew one thing. She didn't want to go back to being nothing. She stepped forward, testing her newly repaired leg on solid ground. The prosthetic was smooth now, responsive, steady, no longer a mess of failing parts and exposed wires. Ethan had rebuilt it from the ground up, fusing human and Calreth technology together until it was something entirely new, something hers. She flexed her fingers, her left arm finally obeying her commands after years of dead weight. The implanted neural connection sending gentle pulses of sensation through nerves she had thought were lost forever. The technology worked. She worked. And for the first time in years, she felt like a whole person again. So, Ethan said, stepping up beside her. First time on a new world. What do you want to do? She hesitated. She wasn't used to being given choices. But the answer came easier than she expected. I want to find something worth fighting for. The galaxy does not forgive. The city of Dainara was a different kind of beast from Vashkai, cleaner, brighter, more refined. But underneath the polished streets and pristine buildings, the same cold reality lurked. Trade was the lifeblood here. And people only cared about you if you had something to offer. Alana knew how to move in cities like this. She knew how to stay in the background, how to listen without being seen, how to read the subtle shifts in body language that told her who was dangerous and who was just pretending to be. It was a skill she had honed in Vashkai, one that had kept her alive. But something was different this time. She wasn't just watching. She was being watched. The realization hit her as they passed through the main marketplace, a sprawling district filled with merchants selling everything from cybernetic implants to stolen starship components. The hairs on the back of her neck prickled. The old instinct she had relied on for years flaring to life. Something was wrong. She turned slightly, scanning the crowd. And then she saw them. Two men, standing too still, their eyes tracking her movements with precision. Not bounty hunters. Not mercenaries. Something worse. Syndicate enforcers. Her breath hitched. They found me. She knew she should have expected it. The syndicate didn't forget debts. They didn't just abandon their property. And no matter how much she wanted to believe otherwise, she was still theirs. Her mind raced. They hadn't made a move yet. Why? Because they were waiting. Waiting to see if she would run. Waiting for her to make a mistake. Ethan must have noticed her hesitation because he leaned in, voice low. We got a problem? She barely nodded. Behind us. Two of them. Watching me. Ethan's expression didn't change, but she saw the shift in his posture, the way his fingers twitched slightly toward his belt, not toward a weapon, but toward a wrench tucked into his tool holster. She almost laughed. The man really was a mechanic first, fighter second. All right, he muttered. What's the plan? She took a slow breath. She had spent years running, hiding, waiting for the past to catch up to her. But she wasn't broken anymore. She wasn't that girl in the gutters of Vashkai, waiting to die. She was Alana, and she was not going back. We take control of the situation, she said. Before they do. A fight worth having. She led Ethan into a side alley, keeping her movements casual, measured, giving the illusion that she hadn't noticed them yet. The enforcers followed, and that was their mistake. The moment they stepped into the alley, Alana moved. Her prosthetic leg whirred as she pivoted, her newly restored balance letting her spin faster than they expected, her metal foot connecting with the nearest enforcer's ribs with enough force to send him crashing into the wall. The second man barely had time to react before Ethan swung his wrench into the side of his head with a sickening crack. Both enforcers went down hard. Alana exhaled, rolling her shoulders. The rush of movement, the sheer fluidity of it, sent a thrill through her system. She hadn't felt this capable in years. Ethan nudged one of the unconscious men with his boot. "You could have warned me you were gonna fight them." She smirked. "You said you wanted a plan. That was the plan." He shook his head, but she caught the small, approving grin he tried to hide. But the victory was short-lived, because now they had a bigger problem. The syndicate knew where she was, and this was only the beginning. She turned to Ethan, her heart still pounding. "We need to go. Now." He nodded. "Already moving. Then let's get the hell off this rock." They ran. Not as prey, not as victims, but as fighters. And this time, she was running toward a future she refused to let go of. Chapter 4. The Price of Freedom. The hum of the ship's engines was a familiar sound now, a constant presence beneath Alana's feet, but this time it carried a weight it never had before. The syndicate was after her. She had known, deep down, that they would never stop hunting her, that her escape had never been true freedom, only borrowed time. But now that they had found her, now that she had fought back, there was no going back to the shadows. She sat in the cockpit, her fingers tapping restlessly against the armrest of the co-pilot's chair. Ethan sat beside her, scanning the navigation console, the quiet tension between them growing heavier with every second. They had made a move against the syndicate, and the syndicate never forgot. Alana exhaled, her pulse still thrumming from the fight. "Where do we go?" Ethan's fingers flicked across the control panel, pulling up a star map. His eyes narrowed slightly as he scanned the available routes, weighing their options. "Somewhere they won't follow. Somewhere off their radar." She scoffed. "There's no such place." His lips pressed into a thin line. "Maybe not. But there are places they'll think twice about stepping into." She frowned, leaning forward. "You have something in mind?" He didn't answer right away, but his fingers stilled over one particular set of coordinates. She followed his gaze and felt her breath catch slightly. The outer fringe, a sector of uncharted space, filled with pirate-controlled territories, lawless zones, and independent worlds that had long since broken free from any governing rule. Her fingers clenched. "That's dangerous." Ethan met her gaze. "So is staying in their sights." He was right, of course. The syndicate had reach, power, resources, but they also had enemies. If they followed her into fringe space, they wouldn't just be hunting her. They'd be making a mistake. She swallowed. "Set the course." Ethan nodded. A few button presses later, the ship jolted as the FTL drive engaged, sending them hurtling toward the unknown. Alana leaned back in her seat, staring at the swirling streaks of light outside the viewport. She had spent so many years waiting, surviving, enduring, but for the first time, she felt like she was finally choosing her own path. She turned to Ethan. "You don't have to do this, you know." He raised a brow. "Do what?" "Follow me into this mess. The syndicate's after me, not you." Ethan let out a quiet laugh. "You really think they're gonna let me walk away after helping you? I might as well have a target painted on my back." Her throat tightened. "I never wanted that for you." His expression softened slightly. "I know. But let me make something clear, Alana, I don't regret it." She wasn't sure what to say to that, because for the first time in a long time, she felt something that had nothing to do with fear, or pain, or survival. She felt safe. A new battlefield. The moment they dropped out of hyperspace, Alana knew they weren't alone. The sensors flickered with incoming readings, 3 ships, moving fast, closing in. Ethan cursed under his breath. Guess we're not the only ones who thought of coming here. She didn't need to check the readings to know who it was. The syndicate was here, and they weren't here to negotiate. "Weapons online," Ethan muttered, flipping switches as the ship's defensive systems hummed to life. Alana gritted her teeth. She wasn't just going to run again. Not this time. She slid into the gunner's seat, her hands moving on instinct as the targeting systems lit up in front of her. The ship jolted as the first blast of plasma fire streaked past them, just barely missing the hull. Ethan's voice was sharp. "You ready for this?" She exhaled. "I was born ready." The ship spun violently, weaving through incoming fire as Alana locked onto the nearest enemy fighter. Her prosthetic leg braced against the seat, her neural implant pulsing with information as the ship's systems synced with her movements. She fired. The first enemy fighter erupted in a ball of fire, debris scattering into the void. Ethan whooped. Not bad. But there was no time to celebrate. The second and third fighters were closing in fast, their weapons glowing as they prepared to unleash a barrage that would tear them apart. Alana's mind raced. They couldn't win this fight head-on. Then an idea. A risky, stupid idea. Trust me, she asked. Ethan didn't hesitate. Always. She cut the ship's thrusters in an instant, sending them into a controlled freefall just as the enemy ships fired. The plasma bolts missed completely, streaking into empty space, and for one split second, the Syndicate ships were right where she needed them to be. Now, she shouted. Ethan slammed the engines back online, pushing them straight up, twisting the ship as Alana fired at point-blank range. Both Syndicate fighters exploded in a single, devastating blast. Silence followed. Alana's breath came in sharp bursts, her heart hammering in her chest. She had done it. She turned to Ethan. He was grinning. That was insane. She smirked. Told you to trust me. The end of the past, the beginning of the future. With the Syndicate ships gone, they drifted through space, the weight of everything settling in. They had won. But this wasn't the end. The Syndicate would come again. They always did. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. So, what now? Alana was quiet for a long moment. She had spent so much of her life being told where to go, what to do, what she was worth. But now the future was hers. She turned to Ethan, a slow smile spreading across her lips. Now, we build something better. His brows lifted. You mean that? She nodded. Yeah, I do. For the first time in years, she wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. She was choosing to fight. For herself. For her future. For the people like her, the ones who had been cast aside and left to rust. And with Ethan beside her, she knew she wasn't doing it alone. Epilogue. Not just a broken thing. They landed on a small, independent colony on the edge of the outer fringe, a place where no law ruled but the one you made for yourself. Alana stepped off the ship, feeling the ground beneath her feet, feeling truly alive for the first time. She turned to Ethan, her voice steady. We're going to change things. He smirked. Hell yeah, we are. And together, they stepped forward, not as a broken girl and a wandering mechanic, but as something new, something stronger, something free. And this time, no one was going to stop them.